is a great honor to introduce someone who I think does not need any introduction, but I will introduce him anyway. Ralph Nader, who is in fact currently the Poynter Fellow in Journalism at Yale. He's quite well known, of course, as our political activist, an author, a lecturer, an attorney, advocating on behalf of consumer protection, environmentalism, and I think most important to all of us, especially to me, what we'll be hearing today, government reform. He's made several bids for president with the Green Party, with the Reform Party. He's an author of several, more than a dozen books, the subject of a documentary. I don't think I need to go on. I'm most interested in hearing his talk today on mobilizing to overcome coercive corporatist politics. As someone who was involved myself in state politics, in a state that has, public financing, bipartisan districting commission, we still, in Connecticut, the best determinant of the election was incumbency. So we have structures that we're really fighting against. On top of that, you add the other dimensions of corporate politics, you have other dimensions for candidates when it comes to race and gender, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So I really look forward to hearing from Ralph Nader and to engaging in conversation after that. So I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Nader.
Thank you for those comments. Yeah, you have a public financing in part in Connecticut, but the law is also very antithetical to third-party access.
Yes.
And I'm sure you know about that. Well, thank you for getting together and spending some time with me. You have students in a class that Professor Poggi conducts, and I understand there's some people watching this or listening to this around the country and the world. So the subject is getting mobilized to overcome coercive corporate powers. And I'm going to start it in an unorthodox fashion, quoting Ney, one of the founders of the European Common Market, when he said, "Without people, nothing is possible. Without institutions, nothing is lasting." So let's start with where you are as students. How predisposed you are to, in your experience at Yale, to developing a public philosophy to guide you throughout life, and whether you are going to build on your civic self-respect and develop a civic personality that highlights civic values as the supreme arch, not commercial values, subordinating civic values. So it really is a very important incubation period, your 4 years or graduate school at Yale or any other university. Otherwise, factual input will be like a water off a duck's back. You'll nod, you'll say how interesting, but it won't change your trek to Goldman Sachs or ExxonMobil or Prudential Insurance or whatever. So let's get underway with a couple predicates. One is that we can only touch on a portion of the whole spectrum of corporate power and how it's seeped into every crevice of our politics, economics, culture, media, far beyond what corporate power was 30, 50, 80 years ago. But we'll try to develop some thematic ways of looking at it that are memorable. I remember when I was at Princeton, there was only one professor who talked about and lectured about power. His name was H.H. Wilson, and he was in the Department of Politics. Imagine, he was the only professor who talked about power in contemporary American society. It took him a long time to become a full professor as a result, even though he published quite a bit. So let's start with the issue of growing up corporate. The way corporate-dominated societies work is they start very early. They start, in pre-kindergarten. Right now, there are corporations, believe it or not, that are trying to get credit cards for 2-year-olds to establish a lengthy credit history. They're working overtime on these little kids. And so if you were to be asked just to test whether you grow up corporate, we all grow up corporate. If you know anybody who doesn't grow up corporate, you're greeting a visiting Martian. It's every grain and every day of our lives. The advertisements, the censorships, priorities, the experiences growing up corporate. So here's one way when you talk with your friends who may be clueless, ask them, when the following words are stated, what comes to mind? Crime, violence, regulation, welfare. Well, they'll say, street crime, violence, aggressive wars, illegal wars, or riots, regulation, government regulation, welfare, people standing in line to get their welfare checks, food stamps, and that's not inaccurate. But quantitatively, it's minuscule compared to corporate crime, corporate violence, corporate regulation of your lives, and regulation of government to regulate you, and corporate welfare or bailouts, subsidies, giveaways. So that opens the conversation. Everything starts with conversation. It doesn't start with an iPhone. It doesn't start with virtual reality. And it definitely doesn't start with metaverse, as Zuckerberg is increasingly finding out. It starts with human conversation. The whole civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, it started with conversation between 2 people, 10 people, 100 people, thousands of people. So you want to start conversations, not only to test your own commitment, if you want to, but also to spread the effort, to spread the reform or the change or the transformation. So you start with violence. Corporations are artificial entities. They're not human beings. They are chartered mostly by states, and the easiest ones are Delaware and Nevada. There are some federal charters by Congress, like Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, but largely they come into creation not by capital investment, normal myth. They are created by the state. As a result, the state limits liability, provides certain immunities, concentrates certain powers in the hands of the board of directors and the executives vis-a-vis the shareholders, and on and on. So why is it that corporations have so much power when they're not mentioned once in the Constitution? Companies not mentioned. It's all we the people. It's all persons. Well, the answer is in 1887 or so, a Supreme Court responded to a railroad lobbyist plea and said that under the 14th Amendment, corporations be considered as persons. So that was the beginning of corporate personhood. That is, they have all the rights, virtually, all the rights. They don't have the right to vote yet. Not yet. All the rights of real human beings. Yet, they have immunities and power far in excess of human beings. They can amass huge capital. They can control labor, capital, media, and it's not a contest. So you have an unequal protection of the laws situation, which the judges don't like you to bring under the unequal provision in our Constitution. So you have corporations getting away with this kind of violence. 250,000 people die every day. 250,000 people die in the United States every year due to what a Johns Hopkins School of Medicine peer-reviewed study called, quote, preventable problems, end quote. That's 5,000 a week. Did you hear about that in the campaign? By anybody? Anybody? National, state, local? Let's go to another one. 400,000 people die still from the related diseases of tobacco consumption. That was hardly never mentioned either, although the tobacco industry is finally on the defensive and being regulated. $3.5 trillion in billing fraud and abuse in the healthcare industry this year. 3.5 billion. Remember, not million, it's billion. Was that discussed? I mean, that's real money, right? It's 350 billion. Scratch the 3.5 billion. 350 billion, which is about 10% of all money spent on healthcare, which is about 3.5 trillion. So 3.5 billion, almost 40% of the overall military budget. And is that discussed at all? Billing fraud is a huge crime all over the country. It's not just the healthcare industry. You ever try to understand some of the computerized billing inserts you're given, if indeed you even look at it in an electronic payment system society? We have 60,000 people, according to earlier EPA estimate, dying from air pollution. We have about the same dying from workplace-related diseases and trauma. We have about 15,000 street and domestic homicides a year by comparison. So all the talk about crime in the election was street crime. They don't even recognize corporate crime. But in terms of dollars, homicides, all kinds of other violent impacts, diseases, trauma, you name it, powers above street crime. Now, the key is preventability. Corporations, they don't have really, as artificial entities, they don't have mens rea. I mean, they really, they don't need to willingly want to destroy these people. They simply do it as a byproduct of maximizing profits. They don't really have a moral content. The executives, people in the corporations who do. So corporate crime, corporate violence. What about regulation? Regulation of corporations of your lives is so deep and penetrating that you don't even feel it. You don't even feel it. Like at Harvard Law School, the contracts professors never once mentioned the one-sided student loan agreements that their students had to sign with Sallie Mae and others before the Department of Education over the student program. It wasn't even felt in the contracts law course at that place. Here's where you don't feel it. How many of you have signed on the dotted line? Credit card, for example, bank deposit. How many of you clicked on the terms and conditions? Well, obviously, all of you. Have you ever thought of scratching out a paragraph and putting in your own, or putting in a different warranty level in terms of mileage of your car? Have you ever tried to do that? Have you ever tried to alter it? You know what would happen. It would cancel your purchase. Who? The vendors. They're now called providers. Vendors. Watch out for the language of control here, like climate change instead of climate violence or climate catastrophe or climate crisis. But somewhere in the back of your mind, you've heard about the freedom of contract. Conservatives talk about the freedom of contract. What kind of freedom do you have? I mean, as a buyer with your seller, can you negotiate different terms? Maybe with a small business, or an antique shop for sale. But by and large, for most purchases, take it or leave it. The drug industry takes it one step further. It's not only take it or leave it, it's pay or die. And so now, when it comes to welfare, again, it's no contest. There were multi-trillion-dollar bailouts of Wall Street, 2008, 2007, the crash. Half of what Washington does is shovel out subsidies, inflated contracts, handouts, giveaways, bailouts, quotas protecting companies from competition, etc. And so that's all welfare. Now, it's interesting, the language. It's often called incentives. Incentives is interesting. And people who get Social Security and Medicare, they're called entitlements. But entitlements did not apply to people who pay in over the years to Social Security and Medicare. But with corporate welfare, they don't pay anything to get bailed out. It's now almost standard procedure. Talk about corporate socialism or the corporate state. Companies that want to build new factories, what's been in the news of the chip factories, they basically go to Washington and say, how much are you going to pay us so we can make a profit? So, the Biden and the Republicans and Democrats just put forth $52 billion to attract chip factories from abroad. Of course, they went abroad to exploit cheap Chinese and other country labor, and with some tax benefits, I might add. And now we have to bribe them to come back here to make a profit. Mind you, this is not a unprofitable industry. It's among the most profitable industry, like Intel and others in the country. Now, why isn't all this taught in school? I mean, when I took economics at Princeton, it was mostly myth-making. It wasn't myth-making, it was empirical starvation. But we were never told that, of course. One day I walked into class in Economics 101, and everybody had a little booklet on the Federal Reserve. And the professor who was on the Philadelphia Regional Federal Reserve Bank said, this is all free. And we sort of said, well, from where? Well, he said, it's the Federal Reserve. So we were studying the Federal Reserve with a booklet printed by the Federal Reserve. And, of course, we never studied the quality of economic performance. It was all quantity. GDP is all quantity. If people get sick because of pollution and they have to spend a lot of money being treated, that registers with the GDP, just like somebody, a nurse, saving somebody's life in an emergency room and generating economic activity. Now, to make all this memorable and to see how deep self-censorship is in our society where you can't even see it, there's a novelist, David Foster Wallace. You may have heard of him. And he was giving a 2005 commencement speech at Kenyon College. And he said something like this, quote, "Greetings, parents, and congratulations to Kenyon's graduating class of 2005. And then he gives a story. There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, 'Morning, boys, how's the water?' And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and says, quote, 'What the hell is water?' Quote. In other words, it doesn't occur in your consciousness. See the exploitation. It's like, what the hell is water? Now, when I was in law school, we had 15 women out of 540 students. I walked into the dean one day because I was editor of the law school newspaper, and I said, "Why aren't more women admitted?" They weren't admitted at all until 1950. He said, "Well, let's be frank. Harvard Law School produces practicing lawyers. Every seat should lead to practicing law, and women can fill that seat and then get married and have babies and not practice law. Purpose of the Harvard Law School." Now, you think today, of course, that would create a riot, but then it was not in our consciousness. What's water? So you want to ask yourself today, what is not in your consciousness? How do you get it there? So here's another way of looking at the economy. Suppose someone asked you, what do you own? What do you have ownership rights in? Make a list. Take out a pencil and make a list. So you start. You own a motorcycle. You own clothes. You own a computer. You own some musical instrument. You own a savings account. You may own a car. You may own some medicines. And you keep going on, and your interlocutor says, "Keep going, keep going." And you're down to, I own some pens, and I own some paper clips. Keep going, keep going. And you say, well, "What are you doing this for? I mean, what are you asking me this for?" Because the interlocutor says, "You're missing something." And you say, "What?" So well, you're co-owner of the greatest wealth in our country. You're co-owner of the public airways, the public lands here and offshore. You're co-owner of all that tax money that has led to the development of most modern industry, from Washington, D.C., R&D, name it. It's not just biotech, nanotech, aerospace. It's internet companies, computer companies, a good deal of the pharmaceutical companies, all pouring out of Washington. National Institutes of Health, Department of Defense, NASA, Department of Agriculture, so on. So how do you grow up not knowing that you're part owner in the greatest wealth in our country? Yeah, the top 1% have a huge percentage of private wealth, as much as you'd think. But if you have a mutual fund, if you're enrolled in a pension fund as a worker, the mutual funds and pension funds own about 73% of all the stock of the major corporations on the New York and NASDAQ exchanges. Well, if they own that much, why don't they control? Isn't capitalism something where you're supposed to have some control over something you own? Another example of how corporations have taken over. They now control what we own, including our own money. Once you go into the credit card payments in gulag, you lose control of your money. They can charge you late fees or unfair fees and charges like the banks, and they just deduct. So the credit card, the suck. And if you ever find out about it, you object. They say, we're just looking at your credit score and credit rating. Do you want to object some more? People get the idea. They understand futility unless they organize. All right, so ownership and control. That's something you should be discussing. Now, and quality of economy. You see, whoever controls the yardsticks, whether it's election campaigns, whether it's university curriculum, whether it's economic performance, controls the dialogue, controls the agenda, controls what is self-censored and what isn't. So for years, the Federal Reserve Chair would go up to the Joint Economic Committee on Capitol Hill for his annual State of the Economy. Almost invariably, they would start out, Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the Joint Economic Committee, the state of the economy is good. And no one says, really, Mr. Chairman, what are your yardsticks? Well, we're looking at capital availability and interest rates and employment and profits. And no one says, what about child poverty? Is that an important yardstick? What about child poverty? What about the state of rentals? Are they becoming more burdensome and more unaffordable? What about the state of the air and the water? What about the level of nutritional foods being sold instead of junk foods full of fat, sugar, and salt? So, millions of students go through these economic courses clueless. They've all accepted the yardsticks, the corporate yardsticks that connect with corporate control, because they don't want the economy to evaluate it in these other people ways. might become an election issue. So let's get to the will of the people here. The polls are showing dramatic left-right support for minimum wage, universal health care, cracking down on corporate crooks, a change in the tax system, a fundamental change in the tax system, criminal justice reform, on and on. So how come the representatives in Congress and state legislatures aren't responding? You're talking 70, 80% sometimes 85% in the polls. You have 70% or more of Republicans opposed to the Supreme Court decision that allows corporations to spend unlimited money for or against candidates as long as they don't cooperate with the campaign. They can just spend on the side, as they just have in hundreds of millions of dollars, the Citizen United case. So why do we just hear about polarization, left, right, red state, blue state? Because it's over a 2,000-year technique of divide and rule by the plutocratic controllers. You know, all societies have concentration of power. The key is how much. One is totalitarian or authoritarian or modestly democratic, etc. So the question is, if the process is at that level we're talking about, can this really be called a democratic society? And you can look up the polls. What happens is that the area of agreement between left-right, between families, conservative families, liberal families, like there was huge support for the $300 child tax credit that the Republicans blocked extension of in January. It had cut child poverty by 1/3 in the United States. Huge. You think conservative families, you know, when they're working and living at the ground level, you think they're ideological, saying, I don't want this $300, even though my child needs it. So all the convergence between self-labeled conservative liberal is not on the table. The media constantly, polarization. Just read the New York Times. Constant polarization, left, right, split down the middle, etc. And so that's another way that you control people, that you do not talk about the issues where they are on the same table, even without one party sponsoring a more progressive or more humane way, just on what they absorb ordinary day of income, of information. I wrote a book called Unstoppable, the Emerging Left-Right Alliance to Dismantle the Corporate State, where around page 60 or 61, I came up with about 24 areas of left-right convergence or concurrence. I mean, you could add your own, just in order to develop a fresh and more candid and realistic public dialogue. Now, are corporations above the law? Yes, for the most part, corporations are above the law. You look at the Corporate Crime Reporter, which is the leading weekly newsletter on corporate crime, and is not in the Yale Law School library. See, they don't like to teach much corporate. It's a little better than when I was at law school. Call it white-collar crime. But most criminal law courses are street crime, domestic violence, corporate. If you read that, you can see that the vast majority of corporate crimes escapes completely. I mean, you know, when you have $350 billion of billing fraud in the healthcare industry alone, and all the negligent loss of life in hospitals, you know, very, very few have to face the brunt of the law, prosecution, or other enforcement mechanisms. It's like Donald Trump. You see, Donald Trump could teach at a law school authentically how he has escaped the law as a corporate crook and a political crook. It's a spectacular education of law students. and this has been over 40 years now. How has he escaped the sheriff? How has he used corporate lawyers to blunt, delay, try to settle out of court secretly, and basically escape? So this idea that nobody's above the law is just nonsense. There are all kinds of powerful people who are above the law. Once in a rare while they get caught, but they go to these nice prisons, that have good food and they can go out and enjoy the garden. But by and large, that's another myth that's taught at law school. All right, so let's extend it even further. Corporations do strategic planning. The bigger they are, the more strategic planning. By the way, my comments don't really relate to small business, individual small business. I'm talking about the giants here. What they used to strategically plan in a more narrow spectrum years ago. Now, all barriers are broken. There are no commercial free zones left of any significance in our country. And the effect of financial institutions abroad, that's the purview of Jim Henry, who addresses your gathering year after year. So you can talk to him about his investigations of how they escape tax laws and violate the laws and the tax havens. Enormous complexity of evasion here. But in this country, they now are strategically planning not only our elections, our governmental processes by putting their people in government and starting the campaign yes of the members of Congress and state legislatures, but they are strategically planning our food processing. They have strategically planned our addictions, tobacco, just deliberate hooking 12-year-olds by passing out free cigarettes in front of schools in America until stopped. They're strategically planning what goes into the air and the water, if they can get away with it, and have for a lot. They're strategically planning our tax system. They've planned it with the undertaxation of the super rich and the corporate to record lows now following the 2007 for his own family. They are strategically planning the housing market, buying up all kinds of homes with investment pools in towns all over America, not exactly obeying community norms here. They're strategically planning our genetic inheritance. They're filing patent claims for genetic sequences. They're strategically planning a lot of land use policy. I mean, it's hard to find out what they're not. I mean, they even have strategic plans for universities, corporatizing universities. They have strategic plans for normalizing organized religion with their contributions. Hard to see what they're not. They're now strategically planning our space race as it increasingly is privatized or corporatized. And so you can they're strategically planning childhood. They now occupy 6 hours a day with the iPhone of tens of millions of children who they've hooked. First they tempt them, then they seduce them, and they addict them. And they separate them in what's called virtual reality, some of it very nasty, some of it very harmful. And they separate them from their family, from community, from nature, and increasingly divorce them from the kind of realities that they're going to have to contend with later. You might want to have at this seminar Susan Linn, Linn. She's a professor of psychology, teaches Harvard Medical School. She just put out a book called Who's Raising the Kids? Big Tech, Big Business, and Big Business. And she gives specifics. Sister Claire Nader just come out with a book directed to tweens, speaking to tweens to try to liberate their inchoate intellect and curiosity and imagination. So they start engaging in elevated conversation suitable to their wonderful talents and their practical idealism. The corporations know no boundaries here. The whole business of infant formula was a calamitous business model that in third world countries led to perhaps hundreds of thousands of infant deaths because it was publicized on television as an index of modernity and good for the young mothers, and they would buy it, and it would be expensive, and they would run out, and in order not to run out, they would dilute it with contaminated water from the village, and you'd have deadly dysentery. It's still going on, by the way. The Nestle Corporation was involved in that. So by now you might see that there are different styles of violence, and the ones that corporations are responsible for are very much under the radar, even though there are investigations from time to time. They neither connect to the legal system of accountability, to the shareholder system of accountability, or the electoral political system of accountability. So they're sort of just out there, and people say, oh my, how terrible this company is, ripping off the opiate promotion companies and so forth. When they are caught, they trade off for monetary settlements rather than incarceration of the culprits. And the monetary settlements are deductible and sometimes depreciable and sometimes insurable. So they hardly feel it. Boeing hardly is felt its 737 MAX crashes. They have the system that in the rare instances when they are caught and they have to pay up, it's insurable, deductible, and sometimes depreciable. And it's on the company, not on the corporate executives. Okay, so what do we do about this? How do we mobilize? Well, first we say, well, what are the institutions that can discipline, restrain these companies? Well, one is called competition. And indeed, there are some good companies. Patagonia is a good company. Some of you know that, outdoor clothing equipment company in Southern California. Interface Corporation, you may not know that. It's the largest tile carpet manufacturer in the world out of Atlanta. And Ray Anderson, who's an engineer, put it on a path of net carbon. And he passed away, unfortunately, a great CEO. But by 2019, they had met net carbon, and now they're going for plus. That is, they're going to give more to the planet than they're going to take it. So there are these kinds of models that can be thrown against the companies that don't behave so well and say, look, these people are meeting the bottom line. They're making a profit. They're treating their workers well. They've got pensions or whatever. And that's one check. It hasn't been working very well because these good companies don't get anywhere near the publicity than the flamboyant, wild talking companies like Tesla and other companies have been in lately. All right. The key countervailing institution is Congress. That's the only institution that has the constitutional authority, taxing authority, appropriation authority, the expose platform, the information authority, and the control of budgets, and the degree to which it can initiate a stronger criminal enforcement regulation by the executive branch and confirm judges that are sensitive to the people instead of the corporation. Now, it's extraordinary when you see these street movements and they're protesting and demanding how infrequent is their conclusion, which is to focus the mobilization on the Congress. It goes up in the ether on a weekend rally on the country like anti-war rally, etc. It doesn't come back down on 535 members of Congress. It's rather strange that in law schools they teach about regulatory agencies, they teach about courts. They almost never teach about Congress. Why? But maybe that's not where the big job pain is, which shapes the law school often. But it's curious. Congress belongs to us. For sovereign power, we the people, is delegated to Congress, 535 of them, and they should be summoned regularly in town meetings by the citizenry, with the citizens' agenda on the table, not a choreographed town meeting by the lawmaker deciding what the agenda is. So when you look at the assets of people in a plutocratic, autocratic, corporatized society like ours, it's staggering how few are unused. The people own most of the wealth. True that. The people are the only ones who vote, not corporations. The people are the ones who outnumber their adversaries by far, 1%. The people are those who have the most emotional commitment. Posterity. Corporations are not very good with posterity. So why aren't the people in charge? How do you mobilize them? Mobilize them, of course, by developing their expectation levels higher and awareness higher. I mean, that's critical to any social justice movement. And, of course, by expanding their range of knowledge. Well, who's going to do that? A tiny number of people. That's the lesson of history. It isn't just 1% controlling the 99%, as the Wall Street encampments would say in 2011. It's the reverse is true, too, that almost all social justice movements never involve more than 1% of the people reflecting majority opinion about injustice or what should be done, knowing what they're talking about, and focusing on the exact arena where the decision has to be made to obtain the just outcome, say Congress or a state legislature or court of law. And it's less than 1%. Now, I'll give you a personal biographical story. When I was at Princeton, I was an all-nighter. I didn't like Princeton by day. I liked to study in the library. They let you study all night at that time. And in the morning, I'd go to catch up on my sleep, and I'd walk down through the beautiful campus with the big trees. And in the spring, I'd see some dead birds, their little legs up, but they weren't mutilated. So one day I took a couple of the birds down to the Daily Princetonian newspaper. I was ushered in down a corridor to a senior who had his feet up on a desk and was puffing away on a cigarette. And I said, you know, I got the sense, I said, that the DDT spraying during the afternoon, and it was so expansive, we'd wipe it off our face when we're going between classes. DDT spraying of the trees might have something to do with these birds. And he leans back and he said, look, kid, I was a sophomore. So we got the smartest chemistry and biology professors anywhere. You think if there was a connection, they wouldn't be shouting it to the skies. That was one of the best instructions I got at Princeton. Because it isn't just what you know, it's what you do. There's an old Chinese proverb going back to the 14th century in the Ming Dynasty. To know and not to do is not to know. It's more than partially correct. And so I go to Harvard Law School, and the unreality is daily. And I say to myself, what's going on here? I go down to South Boston, where the slums were, and I saw where the law was used as an instrument of oppression by landlords, for example, for fine print contracts. And I begin to wonder, I begin to ask myself, what was I going to be as a lawyer? Am I going to represent the 1%? What kind of gratification is that over time? And what will I think many, many years later, looking back? So I started looking into unsafe autos, designed. And I went to the Harvard School of Public Health, and they were doing work on it. How to survive crashes, even if you're in a crash, survive them without injury. And then I stumbled on the Liberty Mutual safety car in Boston. I went down, saw the vice president who built it. He took a four-door Chevrolet and put in all the safety devices, except for airbags, that we take for granted now, that were available then. Think of all the lives and injuries that could have been saved. He had seat belts, rollover bars, collapsing steering columns, padded dash panels, head restraints. And I said, what are you doing this for? You're an auto insurance company. He said, well, the fewer claims we pay, the more money we make. It's called loss prevention, young man. And so I took that, and further, I found out that the Defense Department was losing more Air Force men on U.S. highways than they were in Korea, where there were some conflicts. And so they funded Cornell Medical School and some engineering schools to see how cars could be built for crash worthiness, for crash protection, including, of course, installing seatbelts. And I put all this together in a third-year thesis. And when I got out, I realized that no one was listening to my recommendations. Surprise. So I decided to implement my recommendations. So I didn't have much money then, and I'd hitchhike from New England to Washington to deal with senators and representatives trying to get hearings. And at that time, you'd call up a senator's office, and the first question they'd ask is, who are you with? I'd call from a pay booth. So what do you mean, who am I with? I give my name. I'm a young lawyer, and I see some hearings to establish motor vehicle safety standards. That wasn't good enough for them. Who are you with? So then I'd go down personally, and GM caught wind of it, and they put private detectives on me, following me here and there around the country, trying to get dirt on me, and it was exposed by the media, and got the attention of Congress. There were highly publicized hearings, which led to the motor vehicle and traffic safety laws of 1966, which, irregularly enforced, have saved over 3.5 million lives and countless injuries. Now, there's nothing special about me, except that I had a rage for justice, health and safety. So I had my priorities in order. Could have gotten a job in a law firm. For what? How would I feel? How would I go to work, leaving my conscience at home? Well, unfortunately, for the majority of Ivy League graduates, they're not bothered by those musings, fortunately. So the question I think you have to ask yourself is multifold. What are you going to look back on? If you were, say, like a lawyer at Covington and Burling, and 11 years representing drink that claimed that it was good for tired blood. And the Federal Trade Commission said it was deceptive. There's no proof of what tired blood is and what it was good for, and they should stop advertising. He represented them for 11 years. It may have put his kids through college. How would he feel looking back on that compared to what he could have done with his talent, brains, and justice in society? So you have to project a little bit like that. I don't know if Yale is like Princeton and Harvard. Increasingly, you're coming out without debt. But you have to ask yourself, do you know any names of the trustees of Yale University? Have you ever met them? If they ever had a get-together when they come to New Haven and meet the students in an open auditorium, you got a big one down there. Have a back and forth. You know much about the Yale endowment? Last I heard, it was 28 billion. Why are you paying tuition? What's the endowment for? Just think of that. So in your own institution, you're not given the most elementary rights of access, disclosure, to mention participation. I'm sure you're taught about freedom and liberty in some of your courses. Were you taught what Marcus Cicero's definition of freedom was over 2,000 years ago, the Roman lawyer? That freedom is participation, power. I don't know a better definition. Freedom. So what would a fair society be? Well, you'd have different ways of organizing economic activity. For example, you don't just have shareholder owned corporations with no control. You could have mutuals, like mutual banks. You could have cooperatives, consumer cooperatives. You have worker-owned manufacturing. You could have a variety of government enterprises. You have the Tennessee Valley Authority. You won't find any conservatives from Tennessee and Alabama wanting to change that. They generate a rebellion. There are other government-owned enterprises. So why don't we have a discussion about all of this? Why are we stuck with the corporate model that has refused to deliver in a country of huge wealth? Even by their own standards, they're not delivering. Half the people in this country are poor, defined as dire poverty or near poverty. Half the people. Land of the free, home of the brave. Biggest economy in the world. An economy where one company like Apple can overcharge you for computers and iPhones made by serf labor in China and make so much money that one recent year they bought back $90 billion of their stock in order to improve the metrics for executive compensation. It doesn't create a single job, doesn't invest, just buying back stock. And they don't have to pay any sales tax. There's no Wall Street sales tax. You have to pay Connecticut sales tax when you go into a store. The company or an individual buys 100,000 shares of ExxonMobil, doesn't have to pay any sales tax. So a 0.2% sales tax, which both parties oppose, 0.2%, not 5% or 6% sales tax or Connecticut and higher in New York, would produce $300 billion a year. Think of what that would do. Housing, child poverty, for student loans, health insurance. So anyway, this company spent $90 billion in 1 year, and now Tim Cook, the CEO, he's being paid $100 million. But what does $100 million mean to you? Let me break it down. It's $833 a minute on a 40-hour week. $833 a minute. The average pay for a home health care worker, $14 an hour. So why do I talk this way? Because you not only have to have cognitive awareness, you have to have fire in your belly. You have to have what psychologists now delicately call emotional intelligence. That's what breaks up your daily routine. That's what motivates you. That's what makes you ask a question. Why is my weekend at Yale the same weekend after weekend? Why can't I just get into a car with some of my friends and Sunday afternoon and travel up Route 8 for an hour and visit the only law museum in the world of any kind, the law of wrongful injury, which affects everybody from the streets to the suites, called the American Museum of Tort Law. Can't get students to even achieve that level of curiosity. Tort law should be taught in high school. They know what bullying is. They know what street crime is. They know what car crashes are all about. They know what worker hazards their parents coming home. Not taught. So you have to expand your curiosity. In my sister's book, she gives the example of three well-known people. One day, Isaac Newton was at a gathering, and a person came up to him and said, "Mr. Newton, why are you so much smarter than other scientists?" He said, "I'm not smarter than other scientists, but maybe I have a better ability to concentrate on something at a given time." So William Blake, the poet and writer, England, he was at a gathering. Someone said to him, "Mr. Blake, with whom are you living with these days?" He answered, "Who am I living with? I'm living with my imagination." And Einstein once said, "I have no special qualities. I just have deep curiosity," a little bit immodest. So you take those concentration, imagination, and curiosity, and ask yourself, at what level are you at? What level are you at? You're at the peak of your life in terms of possibilities. You know, when I was at Princeton in my senior year, I felt I could do anything because I hadn't done anything at all. So you have a great open window. Don't get into a routine. Mobilize to overcome the corporate coercions. Opiates are corporate coercions. Addictions, planned and implemented corporate coercions. Fine print contracts are corporate coercion. Controlling your credit score arbitrarily and affecting what you can borrow, corporate coercion. Pollution of the air and water, corporate coercion. Blocking higher minimum wages by PAC-greased congressional or legislative action by corporations, corporate coercion. Corporate control, corporate domination. Start using these words. No one that strategically plans our country 24/7 with the kind of motivation, the singular commercial profit maximizing motivation. Corporations. That's why for over 2,000 years, every major religion warned its adherents not to give too much power to what was then called the merchant class. And that's true to this day. So if we want to mobilize, we not only think of other forms of organized economic activity, and food co-ops are spreading in this country, but we think of what Congress can do. And the main changes that have to be done is not just tougher regulation, health, safety, economic well-being by federal and state and local. That's very important for daily life. But in a structural situation, we have to constitutionally subordinate the corporate entity under our Constitution to the rights and remedies of real human beings. That means unequal protection of the law. The disadvantage of the corporation means that right now they have such supremacy through their wealth and control of the labor, technology, etc., and their equal rights with human beings, that it's not a contest. They have to be subordinated. As Amory Lovins once said, markets are good servants, very bad masters. So the Constitution never addressed the corporation or the company. It needs to be a constitutional issue so that they are prohibited from giving money to candidates or entering into politics. They are prohibited from testifying. Executives of corporations, workers, they can testify. They're real people, but not in the name of the corporation. And other things that they have to be subordinated. So subordination is one. And the second is displacement. There is a growing local economy. Yes Magazine chronicles a lot of that out of Seattle. Yes Magazine. So every time you spend your dollar and you go to a co-op, you're undermining the big food chains. Every time you go to a credit union, you're undermining the Bank of America types. Every time you save energy or you use local solar or wind power and conservation, you're undermining the sales of ExxonMobil and the coal companies. Every time you take care of yourself, good nutrition, exercise, and you have community clinics, you're undermining the health industrial complex. Is so very dominant now economically and in terms of deciding who can get health care under what conditions. So to finish the story that I had, I started a lot of groups because I didn't want to be a lone ranger after the victory over the auto industry in 19. And in starting the groups, I tapped into the students. Because at that time, the universities were coming alive with the civil rights, women's rights, environmental movement. They really achieved, Earth Day really achieved legislation. To this day, has never been duplicated. The Air and Water Pollution Control Acts, the establishment of the EPA and OSHA, and so on. And remember, on Earth Day, April 1970, there were 1,500 events all over the country, marches, demonstrations, a lot of them on campuses. Look at the campuses today. They're like dead zones in most areas defined as corporate control, coercion, abuse, manipulation, etc. Like dead zones. There's a little activity on climate, a lot of activity on identity politics, which is basically the way the corporate structure has diverted young people today. You see all the black models in the New York Times magazine? That never happened before. So they're giving symbols, but black people couldn't begin to afford what is being sold these black models in the New York Sunday magazine. So, they're using the language, they're using the symbols, the pictures, the photographs, but they're still in control. Traditionally, universities and colleges were the incubators of social justice movements, possibly more, except for certain years, than even labor unions. We used to go to mobilize the country to universities. They'd be jam-packed, the auditorium at Yale. They'd be hanging from the rafters, literally. And then we'd have sign-ups, clipboards. You want to be an intern. You want to focus on this. You want to do a senior paper on that. And that's what fed the women's movement, the social, civil rights movements, environmental. What movements can we start today on college campuses? What you're experiencing in the last 2-3 days is unique. Most students don't have the kind of speakers that you had over the last 2-3 days. But it won't matter unless you develop a civic self-respect, a public philosophy of what you want to do in the next 15,000 days or so before you retire. It goes very fast. It goes faster as you grow older. And what your civic personality is like. There are athletes who are as skilled as one another. Basketball, like Jordan. But what made Jordan different was his desire to win in the last few minutes. Civic personality, just someone who comments on the terrible situations in the social scene, political, economic, but actually does something. And the civic personality is one that gives credit to other people. Doesn't hog credit. It's one that keeps up to date on knowledge. One that keeps thinking, how do I learn from my last failure or mistake when a company or industry beat us at the local, state, or national level? You can elaborate it yourself, what a civic personality is. But that is what is key for the 1% or less of the citizenry needed to change the country. You had 2.5 million adults who had Congress Watch groups as hobbies, like some people play bridge and some people collect stamps or whatever. 2.5 million, it's 1%. And they represented majority opinion, like on a lot of these issues that I mentioned. And they wanted change in Congress. There's no corporate combination that could defeat them. Because it would be a left-right coalition would be unstoppable. So why is it so hard to do that? Most people do much harder things in their life than be active, focused citizens. Much harder. Have to raise children. Try that one. Or they have to deal with illness in the family or accidents or any number of things, not being able to pay the bill, maybe being forced with bankruptcy and support your family. When it comes to civic action, oh, God, it's so, oh, they're all corrupt. It won't make any difference what I do. There are all kinds of excuses. A vibrant democracy full of citizens who don't make excuses for themselves, especially when they control the sovereign power under the Constitution. Okay, so we have subordination, displacement with local economies, and we have the day-to-day accountability mechanisms, some of which I mentioned, others mentioned in your 2 or 3 days, I'm sure. Those are the day-to-day checkpoints, the road bumps, which tell people hungry for power and abuse, stop, look, listen, or you'll be held accountable. It's called deterrence. And that's why undergraduates should be taught the 2 private pillars of justice in our country, the law of contracts and the law of torts. Freedom of contracts, supposed to be able to negotiate freely without asking any politician or any CEO permission. Companies are destroying it with fine print contracts, one-sided. Don't study it. Tort law, even more. We have a high school curriculum on tort law. You don't have to be a law student to study tort law, the law of wrongful injury. You don't go as deep as they do, but you got enough so that you can negotiate life, know what your rights and remedies are, know how to talk to people who engage in wrongful injury. So let me end on this note, and then we can go into the exchange. The vast area of what's known as the corporate phenomena global range. Corporation is a very determined entity because it has one value system. It's not interconflicted the way human beings are. It's maximize sales, profits, and bonuses to the bosses. That's what it's. That's why it gets its determination and power from that kind of focus, laser beam focus. Having that, it's able to game countervailing powers. Look, how have they gamed the vote? Gamed it with campaign money, propaganda, political toadies, you name it. How have they gamed the access to the courts? By passing laws limiting damages, limiting the autonomy of juries, corporate law firms engaging in the law of attrition, wearing down the the defendants. Ask yourself, how have they gamed all these things? You understand how to ungame them. Like how have they gamed the freedom of contacts and take it away from us? How have they gained parental supervision, undermining parents, directly marketing to kids? That was unheard of 50 years ago, except maybe for bubblegum. Now, it's a $500 billion industry, bypassing parental guidance and control, direct marketing, junk food, junk drink, other harmful products, and then you have the whole internet gulag with the iPhone. So you understand that's really a great subject in political science. So I urge you, if you're writing papers for seminars or courses, write papers that may not occur to your faculty. Write papers that may provide you with a career, a mission, a goal, a meaning in life. Let me stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I will open it up for questions, and you can raise your hand or put a question in the chat. And Mr. Nader, let me take the opportunity to just ask the first question, because I'm struggling a bit. Well, first of all, I appreciate everything you said and everything you do to mobilize the public. And I'm struggling a bit with that question of mobilization. So just to give you my personal context, I've run in a race in the state legislature in Connecticut in a Republican district as a Democrat, a homogenous district as a woman of color, on a platform of democratic reform, constitutional reform as a constitutional scholar. And it took quite some effort to build those relationships, as an admirer of John Dewey, focusing on participatory practice. And as you said, at the doors, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, a lot of those political reforms are things people wanted to see. They wanted to see more parties, independent party. They wanted things like term limits, particularly the political reforms. There was a lot of consensus. And that too, after it took a long time to run with a funny sounding name and to get people to really build those relationships. So what happened coming within 200 votes last time is this district was gerrymandered, and most problematically, racially gerrymandered, to take out not only the most Democratic part of the district, but the most diverse part of the district. And this is regular. And I say Connecticut is not the worst state, worst offender in the country, and yet we still have these problems. And what you hear then at the door are the kind of the narratives that don't really exist: critical race theory in the schools, crime that really isn't a problem. And there's so many narratives that we have to, respond to. You can tell because of Fox News, because of the corporate news stations, where people are getting their information, and they're completely misled, even though they share a commitment to political reform. And on top of it, with the constraints of the system, so with the gerrymandering and with the redistricting, it almost felt like a fool's errand. It was impossible to do this to begin with, even though that message was really well received. So my question to you is, given those constraints, and this is at a level of, again, a state where there is public financing. I mean, we do have fairly competitive districts, even though they get slightly gerrymandered. And still, that those impacts almost seem like they're impossible to overcome. So, how do we mobilize in the face of those kind of constraints, particularly now as, people who are outliers, and as, when it comes to gender, when it comes to race, how do we pull all those things together?
Well, because I don't know the details of your present case, I can talk in general. And you have to look at history here. It takes time to break through. You're building bricks to build a structure. Justice is not a spontaneous combustion of light and virtue. Look how long the civil rights struggle continued. Look at Thurgood Marshall, how many cases he lost in court before he started winning. Eugene Debs, a great labor leader, once said, in the struggle for justice, you have to learn how to lose until you win. So impatience is good because it thwarts delay, but too much impatience can lead to burnout, immediate burnout. Well, I made the major effort. I did all the right things. I received great applause for my statements, and people didn't deliver, and they couldn't because they were gerrymandered, etc. Well, the answer is try again. Be more effective. Spread the range of your impact. Increase your coalition. Increase the people with you. It doesn't happen overnight, and the burnout problem is very susceptible for young people because they're impatient. And they can't figure out how stupid the opposition is. How can people even tolerate it? Look at the fury in the words of Greta Thunberg. She can't believe how adults could be so suicidal or omnicidal. So the idea is, after you lose, then you figure out, which the Democratic Party is very bad at, why you lost. You don't scapegoat the Green Party. You say, hey, if we're the party of the people, like we brag, why are we losing to the worst Republican Party in history that stands against the interests of women, children, labor, minorities, the environment, almost anything that spells human in favor of corporate paymasters. So that's the way. You just try again, try again. It doesn't often happen the way AOC did it on the first round. She caught the incumbent congressman napping. He thought he was just going to walk in. And she won with just 13,000 votes in the primary. There were just 13,000 people turned out or so in the primary. But she won on the first round. But a lot of times you don't. It took me 9 years to get a congressional hearing. And then it happened very fast. We got, from the first hearing, got the biggest industry in the country regulated. In 9 months, Lyndon Johnson signed at a ceremony in Ohio in September 1966. Why? Because in the failing, year 1, 2, 3, we were laying the groundwork for an aroused public and a more informed public and a more demanding public.
Great. Thank you for that response. And we have about 10 minutes. So I want to make sure, Thomas, you have a question, and please feel free to raise your hand or put a question in the chat and I can read it out loud. Oh, Thomas, you're muted.
Sorry about that. So two-part question. One is, why are people in general today so much less mobilized, as you point out, than they were maybe 20, 30 years ago? And secondly, what are the issues that you think would be most suitable to getting people, younger people, remobilized? Are these issues that impact them directly, where their self-interest is engaged in some way, where they are being oppressed or in other ways harmed? Or might they be the most suitable issues to mobilize people, be issues where their own interests are not at stake, but where they might say, I have a responsibility as citizen to see to it, for example, that the US emissions do less harm abroad, or that drone strikes don't kill lots of innocent people in other countries, and so on, where you might say I myself am safe, but I have a responsibility to do something to protect others.
Well, starting with the issues, it depends on the time, place, and people. You don't try to focus people on one or two big issues. Some people are very concerned about homeless. That's their issue. Concerned about student loan rackets. That's their issue. Sort of global climate. That's their issue. They're concerned about gerrymandering. There's a 27-year-old woman in Michigan who stumbled on an article about gerrymandering in Michigan. Listen to this story. She said, this is outrageous. I mean, we have the Republicans in the state legislature. They're like 70%, and they only got 45% of the vote or whatever because of gerrymandering. So she starts a referendum petition, and she gets more and more people. Mind you, she took her about 2 years, and she put a referendum on the ballot, and the Republicans fought it tooth and nail, and she beat them. And in the process, she raised $15 million to do ads and so forth, and she won, and it just went into effect this year, and it worked like magic in terms of more equitable representation in the legislature. And she did all this between 27 and 30. So that was her passion. So answer your question is you take the issue that you are predisposed temperamentally, cognitively, logistically, whatever, to pursue. Now, there are some issues we all have to pay attention to. I call them omnicidal issues. One is preparedness for pandemics and epidemics, viral and bacterial. The second is global warming. I'm not prioritizing them, just listing them. Third is the vast destruction of any kind of systems of justice, where you have elected dictatorships in effect, like you have in parts of the world. So there are certain things where, as citizens, we have a common obligation, all of us. We have to spend some bit of our time on these omnipresent issues. But in terms of commitment, we wouldn't want people committed to one big issue. Even if you're committed to a democratic society, you got to break it down into sub-issues that you are committed to and focus on. In terms of why people aren't, that's the most fundamental question, Professor Oji. Why aren't people motivated to pursue what they believe is the right path? So this isn't pre-persuasion. They already know what the just outcome is: living wage, for example, right to form unions, etc., right to have your children grow up in clean air and clean water and so on. So they are already predisposed. So why don't they act? Why don't they take knowledge to action? But one reason is that the political duopoly doesn't present them with adequate choice. So if they want to go after corporate abuses, the corporations got their hooks in both the Democrat and Republican Party. And all these issues I mentioned are not talked about by the two parties, like corporate crime. They can't even pronounce the two words, even the Democrats. So without choice, you get an enhanced degree of withdrawal and apathy. The second reason is people are connecting personally with one another less and less. Sidewalks are empty. Front porches are empty. People are into their own entertainment in their living rooms, in their iPhones, in their computers. They're on screen rather than in person. And so it's hard to get people to come out for civic meetings, hard to get people to come out for town meetings like in New England. It's hard to people to come out for book authors. And it's really hard for to get students in auditoriums anymore. You got people who used to go to colleges and universities on problems that still exist today, and they would jam the auditorium. And now they're not even invited because the Speakers Bureau said they can't get enough people. They can't get enough students to even partially fill the auditorium. So those two forces are deadly. The lack of interpersonal interaction, humans to humans, and the automated gadgets that get in the way are further insulating people. So that now teenagers don't like to talk on a traditional phone. They can't stand the interaction. They text message. Well, when I was growing up, you couldn't stop teenagers from talking on the phone. So those are the two things. And that's why we have to have third parties. We have to have nonpartisan elections at the municipal level. We have to give more choice in order to give voters more voice. But civic motivation, I should say, should be a major topic for political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists. People ask me what's the biggest problem in the country today. It's the withdrawal or lack of civic motivation. Nothing happens without civic motivation.
Okay, a couple of questions in the chat, and then there's a hand raise as well. So one for when it comes to this third party, is it perhaps time for a party that's focused on democratic reform, so a democratic reform independent party? And then how would you react against the myth of Adam Smith's invisible hand?
Well, Adam Smith himself was for public works and public education, and he said, watch out when you see a half a dozen business people around the table. They're largely conspiring to rig the markets, the free markets. So he was widely misused by today's propagandists. There's no free market without freedom of contract. There's no free market when some companies are subsidized to the disadvantage of others by the government. There's no free market when you have predatory practices of big business against small business challengers. There's no free market when there's corporate crime that isn't enforced, because corporate crime disadvantages companies that obey the law. So that's the brief answer to that. And what was the other one?
For a third party that's focused on democratic reforms.
Yeah. Well, regularly for the last 50 years, 50 to 65% of the people, when asked, do you think we should have a viable third party? They say yes. But when you get a third party on the ballot, they don't vote for it. Why? Because they're practical enough to say to themselves, I want to vote for a winner. And the only ones who can win are either Democrat or Republican. So why waste my vote? So what you're going to need to do is what was done when you had the Liberty Party in 1840. It was against slavery. It was the first party overtly against slavery. Well, it set things in motion, not entirely, the abolitionists, so on, for the creation of the Republican Party, which replaced the Whig Party. So it didn't start out in 1854 with a tiny party of 2% or 3%. It replaced a party. So the only third party, unless we can completely revolutionize our media access, ballot access laws, etc., which we've written about extensively, is a broad-based party from the get-go that, in effect, reduces one of the major parties to minor party status. Because we have a winner-take-all system, and we have an electoral college system. And so they disenfranchise a lot of people, namely the people who get 49% instead of 51%, or that way. See, they under a winner-take-all, and they don't have a proportional representation, 49% of the people get nothing, or in some countries they get 49% of the lawmakers. So that's the only thing I can see right now is such disgust that you have well-funded, I hate to use the word, centrist perceived party that basically dissolves one of the collapsing two parties that has been on hard times. And you can see that one party is already on hard times and could be collapsing in the next 2 years. And it replaces the party, because the two-party duopoly is installed in law. It's installed in all kinds of sustainable things, including no rank voting, no proportional rep, winner-take-all, electoral college, and media perception. The media, if they don't think you have a chance to win, like the Green Party, they won't cover you. I mean, I was recognized by over 85% of the people in this country, and when I ran on the Green Party in 96 and 2000, I learned that not more than 10% of the people even know I was running. And if they don't know you're running and they go to the polls, why are they voting for you? They don't even know you're running. And that's what the media did to us. They kept saying to us, and they would say it to us when I go down with editors and talk to them about it. Well, we're not covering you because you can't win. One time I said to the Washington Post editor, well, why are you covering the Washington Nationals baseball team? They're in the cellar. We have another question?
Yes, we do. So two more, and maybe we'll make these the last two questions. Maya, you have your hand up, and then there's a question in the chat that I'll read after that.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for recognizing me to ask this question. A lot of my peers and Professor Pogge know that I am a very big supporter of you, Mr. Nader. So thank you so much for coming to Yale. I'm curious just about what you were saying about unity between parties. So while there's a large kind of congruence between the left and the right when it comes to political reform, I mean, you specifically said there are 24 areas at least that they all agree on. It still seems like there is this kind of rhetorical asymmetry between Democrats and Republicans. For instance, when it specifically comes to the issue of Citizens United, which you mentioned, it seems like the left represents political equality and the right represents political speech. And it's interesting because the other day I actually had the privilege of speaking with Mr. Floyd Abrams. He was the attorney who represented Mitch McConnell in this decision. And even he conceded that it's equally requisite to protect disclosure mechanisms as it is to protect First Amendment interests. And this was just shocking to me because I thought he was the public enemy of justice and political equality, right? So there is a lot more unity than is perceived. And you said that this lack of the appearance of unity is largely a consequence of corporate control in the media. So I guess I'm just curious now, after thinking about this, how do we unify people if there is this appearance that we aren't unified?
Well, you start where the polls are overwhelmingly in your favor, and they're overwhelmingly Republican and Democratic voters support disclosure. They don't like big money in politics, and they don't like Citizens United, for example. They don't like gerrymandering, which is like the candidates picking the voters instead of the voters picking the candidates. When you get into some more detail, they'll start disagreeing with one another. But on the broader issues, you build a base of consensus and you go forward. The big detail is public funding of campaigns. I mean, campaigns should not be privately funded. I mean, national parks are funded by taxpayers. Public schools are funded by taxpayers. I want to have elections funded by taxpayers with free access to the mass media because we own the public airways. They would have free access under formulas, TV and radio, which would save most of the money they raise now, where they spend on. So that the public financing versus letting private financing, that does divide a lot of Republicans and Democrats. But once you get them agreeing on these other points, and they start educating themselves, and they start learning about public institutions compared to private institutions, and the two should not mix, especially since the private institution is often the aggressor because it's profit-seeking. You'll get a greater consensus, but you start with those basic areas of agreement. It's amazing to see over 70% of the Republicans, maybe higher, are opposed to Citizens United when it's explained to them. By the way, I had some questions from some of you on the Henry George. Henry George, a very interesting economist in the late 19th century, still relevant today, although it's too big and complex economy with too many public needs just to tax the unearned increment of land values. But he has a point. You know, when you have politicians getting certain developments tax funded in a community and it suddenly, say a highway route, which actually has happened, and suddenly the land near it quadruples. And you see, under single tax by Henry George, they would tax the unearned increment. And it's very, very relevant today, but it's not enough. So I'm glad that some of you are reading Henry George and applying it to today's economy.
Thank you. And I'll just make this the last question in the chat. If we knew what we knew now about corporate greed and abuse, we may not have established them. But now that we already have them, what do we do? How do we mitigate their impact on the rights of the global poor?
Well, I mean, that is obviously a very comprehensive question. I mean, one way is they have to be separated from delivering to certain people that they don't deliver to. So when you have the local poor, you don't beg, cargo to ship grain to Africa. You tax them. They're tremendously undertaxed. The tax is about 21% if they pay it. The real tax of corporate profits is about 14%. Many big companies avoid federal income tax for years at a time, like General Electric did when they were making profit. And the tax on the wealthiest individuals is up to 37, 38%. So why are individuals taxed but not higher? Corporations are. So you tax them. Number two, you develop the economies at work. You develop land reform systems. You develop cooperative health clinics. You develop cooperative labor unions. You develop a local economy. You're not going to get very far waiting for giant corporations to deliver to poor people on earth. And then the third, obviously, there has to be democratic political institutions where there's some really interesting things going on. The Ashoka group in Virginia that supports leaders in third world countries at the community and village level. You should look it up, ASHOKA. It's an Indian. Ashoka, and they have an annual report with the pictures of the people that they support, like someone wants to deal with safe drinking water, which is the lack of is a major killer in the world, especially among children. They will support that person, and that person then escalates it so it goes beyond the village. It becomes regional policy in the country. So connect with some of these things, some of these groups. They will answer your questions in a much more concrete manner.
Thank you so much. So we're over time, and this was really a wonderful opportunity and a terrific talk. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
I just have one more thing. Can I say one more thing?
Of course.
There was a question saying, you mentioned in Getting Steam that corporations are too big to fail, too big to tax, too big to punish, too big to exist. What metrics should the government use to establish which corporations must be broken up? Well, you know, the conservative syndicated columnist George Will, he once wrote a column. He said, if the big banks are too big to fail, they're too big to exist. This is a right-wing conservative. For 50 years, he's writing a column. So one way is you break them up under the antitrust laws. Another way is if they are environmentally deadly, if they are producing untold human and property damage, you have a law that throws them into environmental bankruptcy. Right now, the only way a company can be thrown into involuntary bankruptcy is if it doesn't pay its creditors. An economic reason. What about an environmental health and safety reason? So you expand the environmental bankruptcy laws. And then there are other ways to break them up, like Facebook can be broken up by making them disgorge WhatsApp and Instagram, which they bought with stock in order to fend off competition. So the Federal Trade Commission is actually looking into that. Another way is you have mutual funds and pension funds get together and break up their own company into several parts, which historical experience shows they actually make more money as shareholders. When Standard Oil was broken up into different parts of itself over 100 years ago, the shareholders got got shares in the pieces, and they actually made more money. So the pension funds and mutual funds, but they are not democratically run. See, they're run from the top, from people who are overpaid and get bonuses. So all the money that is controlled by workers and savers, they've given control to a few people at the top of their own mutual funds, like Fidelity and pension funds. So it all comes down to the will of the people. If they don't have the energy, stamina, self-respect, aspiration, fearlessness to assert the power they already have, the issue is, why aren't they using the power they already have? Most justice movements want to add power to the masses, which is good because there's a lot of power they don't have. But they have huge power. They own the greatest wealth in the country. They could have their own radio and TV stations because it's public property. Why have they let the Congress and the Federal Communications Commission give licenses to these radio and TV stations who decide who says what and who doesn't 24/7, and pay no rent? The reason why my speeches, for example, don't reach a bigger audience is because these tenants who pay no rent, the radio and TV stations, who pay no rent to us, the landlords, we're the owners, keep people like me off. And people who have advanced justice or want to advance justice. Look at NPR, even NPR and PBS. They're more and more turning into an entertainment network. They have some good programs, but they shouldn't have all this entertainment. And they're increasingly funded by corporate donors at the local and national level. So we lost control of that. I worked hard to get the legislation with others through in 50 more years ago for public radio. I never dreamed they would have ads. The whole idea was to have public radio and public broadcasting funded by the taxpayer without ads. Now I've clocked public radio. They have 30 ads on the average an hour. 30 ads an hour on public radio. So there are all kinds of ways. We need your thoughts, your ideas, your pioneering initiative. We don't pander to young people because we need you. We're not pandering to you. Oh, the next generation is so optimistic and idealistic. They'll bail us out. The older generation, no. You can become just like us, you know. Bury your head in the sand. Forget about the main problems. Defer the main problems. Pursue your own material goals, and then have your children and grandchildren curse you when the globe collapses with global warming or something like that. You don't want that. We need you, and you should feel needed, and you should feel that as a student you are an active citizen. We have these student public interest research groups. We started all over the country. They're the main civic movement for students. NYPIRG in New York, for example. MassPIRG, California PIRG. The students fund it with student government money or a few dollar assessment or door-to-door canvassing. And they hire full-time lawyers, economists, organizers, mobilizers, community people, and they get a lot done. So don't think you're a citizen in preparation. No, you're a citizen right now, and you may never be as broad-gauged and idealistic than you are right now. So take advantage of it. And you get my column free every week if you want. Just go to nader.org, 7 minutes of agitation. Every week, sign up. You get it automatically free. And if you want to listen to my radio hour, it's on Bridgeport Station, 6 p.m. every Sunday, WPKN, the community radio station. And Bridgeport beams right into New Haven. Thank you for being there, and I only wish that we could have a longer time, but I know you have to wrap it up. So let's see you at the Tort Museum. Break your routine, Sunday afternoon, 1 to 5.
Thank you so much.
Tortmuseum.org. Just go to tortmuseum.org and you'll get the detail. Thank you.
Thank you. Powerful statements and our obligation now to get mobilized. So terrific. Thomas, I'll turn it back to you at the end of the conference.
Nothing more to say except to thank everybody, Ralph Nader, Sujata, and all of you who were here and asked questions and participated. Wonderful to see you all, and onward.